Hello and welcome along to the Sunday Politics in the West. Coming up this week, living in filth. We revealed the appalling state of some of Bristol's rented properties. Tenants complain they are unable to escape from crooked landlords. But is there anything our politicians can really do to clean things up? And we have two squeaky clean politicians with us today. They are Labour's candidate for Bristol West, that's Thangham Debonair.
Hello, David.
And the Lib Dem candidate in the Cotswolds, Paul Hodgkinson. We'll hear from them in a moment. First, ask people for their number one concern right now, and the NHS tops the list. No wonder then that the political parties are falling over themselves to claim the health service is safest in their hands. This week it was Labour's turn with a promise to reverse the privatisation that took off under their watch. Here's our health correspondent, Matthew Hill.
To become a mother is nature's most wonderful gift.
Since its inception, the NHS has always been free at the point of delivery.
At Bristol's Southmead Hospital, the good foursome, all girls, are being cared for
But in recent years, more and more of its work's been outsourced to the private sector. So when Bob White from Bristol needed a routine procedure, he was offered an appointment at a privately run hospital at Emerson's Green. But rather than being treated, he was turned away, told that his blood pressure and diabetes made him too high risk.
I think that's disgraceful because endoscopy is is a simple procedure. They're doing 50, 60 a day over Old Frenchy, but now we've got a problem and you can't book one in early. You've got to wait until the system comes through.
Care UK has a multi-million-pound contract with the NHS to treat patients at Emerson's Green, as well as other centres in Cirencester, Shepton Mallet and Devizes. It comes to an end in October. The lobby group Protect Our NHS has just handed in an open letter signed by 1 in 5 Bristol GPs, which calls on the NHS to rewrite the contract so that private companies are excluded. It says Care UK has received £7 million for operations it's not carried out because patients chose not to go there. It says the company cherry-picks patients, leaving the NHS to treat more complex cases, and if there are complications, referring patients back is either impossible or difficult.
Well, Care UK, that runs centres like Emerson's, have declined my request for an interview, but in a statement they say they refute any allegation that they cherry-pick patients. The cases they take on, they say, are determined by guidelines from the local NHS. But as to the question of whether the private sector will continue to operate on more and more NHS patients, well, that's down to politicians and the general election.
The Tories would let this great service wither and die.
I warn you not to fall ill, and I warn you not to grow old.
This party created the National Health Service and we will save it.
Labour has always tried to present itself as the party of the NHS. This week, Shadow Health Secretary Andy Burnham vowed to reverse the amount of outsourcing to the private sector, which began under the last Labour government and now stands at 6% of total NHS funding.
If we allow market forces to continue to take hold, they will eventually break the NHS apart.
But this will mean yet more reorganisation, which sends shivers down the spine of the GP in charge of buying healthcare in Bristol.
I wouldn't necessarily call it privatisation. It's an improvement. It's an increased option of choice, and any provider can bid for that. It opens up the marketplace. The contract stipulation is the important bit. If the contracts are written right and the quality and the outcomes are defined, then it shouldn't matter in theory who bids to fulfil those contracts.
Since it began, the NHS has faced countless reforms. The question now is, could yet more reform safeguard the NHS from privatisation or wreck the very competition that keeps the NHS on its toes?
Well, it's a hot topic, of course. Let's start with Labour and Thangham. If a private company gets involved, does a good job, and the patient doesn't get a bill, what's wrong with privatisation?
One of the things that's wrong with privatisation as it stands at the moment is it isn't any provider, it isn't that the public sector gets to have the first preference and private providers can come along to fill in certain gaps if necessary and appropriate. What we've got at the moment is a system where it can be any provider can bid for virtually anything. And as they're profit making, inevitably they're going to be taking away some of the money that should be invested in patient care.
But if they provide a good service and the patient doesn't get a bill, what difference does it make?
Well, you saw what difference it makes on that clip. There was a gentleman there who wasn't getting the treatment he needed because he was deemed too high risk. The cherry picking that Protect Our NHS have referred to in their statement is taking place. We know it's taking place.
Why did Labour introduce this in the first place?
Well, from 1945, private providers have been involved in the National Health Service. GPs, from the very start, were private contractors. It's always been the case that there's been private providers in certain places. The problem is when we're offering out patient care. So when we're offering out the services...
Your GP is probably a private person.
Your GP is employed as a self-employed subcontractor. So what I'm saying is it's not necessary that everything's run by the state for it to work well. What we've got at the moment is that the bits that make the most profit can be sold off to any private provider that wants it, rather than having a proper assumption which starts from the point that an NHS should be publicly provided.
Paul, has Labour got an election winner with this one? You're from the Lib Dems. You helped to bring in the reform of the NHS, which cost billions, and opened the door fully to more private companies.
Well, you saw from the statistics there that the amount of privatisation, in inverted commas, is hardly up at all compared with what happened under the last Labour government. And Labour introduced privatisation. I think you had a point there when you said that actually it's all about service to the patient. If I, as a patient, am getting the service I need, am I getting the healthcare I need, then actually it doesn't really matter to me who's providing that, provided that the bulk of that service is provided by the state. So if a private company is doing that, they're doing it well, and they're doing it at a reasonable cost, why on earth should political dogma get in the way of that?
Does it bother you that they make a profit out of it?
Sorry?
Does it bother you that they make a profit out of it?
It bothers me if there's excessive profit made, and certainly in the piece you showed, I believe people are saying that Care UK is making an excessive profit. That's not right. I don't agree with that. But I think if you bring a private company in, private companies are about some degree of profit. A reasonable profit is fine, and it's about what the patient's getting.
Because one of the things that happened under the current government, which is a Liberal Democrat and Tory government, so a Liberal Democrat, your party helped to bring in billions of pounds worth of reorganisation that nobody voted for, that nobody wanted.
But you want to bring in more reorganisation to take it out?
We just want to stop things.
So another
we want to stop it going any further. No, we want to stop things from going any further. We've been really, really clear. We've been very clear. Andy Burnham's been extremely clear. He has listened to people who work in the NHS who have said, we don't like what's happened,
so
but please don't reorganise. No, we repeal the Health and Social Care Act, which stops bits of the NHS being sold off. It stops that wasteful reorganisation, which we've had under your...
But if the service is... If the patient...
Very quickly.
If the patient is getting what they need...
They aren't. They clearly aren't.
And that's not true. Actually, that's not true.
Now, complain about a broken tap or faulty radiator in your rented home and you could be thrown out onto the streets. That's the claim from housing charities who believe tenants deserve greater protection from their landlords. Landlords claim the reverse is true and that they are at the mercy of tenants. So how should government settle this very domestic argument? Here's Robin Markwell.
Britain's rented sector is booming. It's doubled in size in just 10 years. But lurking behind the walls, some home truths. 1 in 3 properties fail to meet the government's minimum standards for decent homes. Take this place in East Bristol. 5 people live in this squalor. They pay £157 a week for the privilege.
Yeah, there's an extreme damp and mould coming through the roof here, which has collapsed due to a shower a few floors above.
We couldn't contact the landlord. The residents were afraid of speaking out, but a campaign group has taken up their cause.
It's disgraceful, it's shocking, there's absolutely no way that people should be living like this. I think it's criminal that people can make people live in these circumstances, charge money for it, which is adding insult to injury, and that nothing's been done about it.
This is the security I've got on my front door.
Just a few streets away, and another unhappy tenant.
A press lock that my sister fitted for me. Well, up there you've got a lovely damp spot that looks like a scary face. I don't think the guttering's been cleared for years.
She believes many people now live in fear.
A lot of people are afraid to say what's wrong because there's nowhere else to go for a lot of people. Yeah, and I just don't think it should be like that. I think housing should be a right.
They call them revenge evictions, where a complaint to the landlord is swiftly followed by a move to evict. The housing charity Shelter believes it affects more than 200,000 people in a year. It's done through so-called Section 21 notices, but the government wants to make it harder for landlords to issue them. A Bristol MP is hoping to push through the legislation before the election.
What we're going to do is to put in place a provision saying if a tenant has complained about safety in the home and the local authority has inspected the flat and has issued an improvement notice saying this must be repaired, this boiler really ought to have been serviced, then the landlord cannot evict at that point. And more to the point, they actually have to do the work as well.
But that's not gone down well with the landlords. Paul Routledge owns over 120 flats in Weston-super-Mare. He now runs a database allowing landlords to share information about tenants. He thinks, if anything, it's the tenant that has the whip hand.
If a tenant doesn't pay his rent, we have to go and get an eviction. And it can take up to 6 months minimum, up to a year. Yeah? But we have to keep providing them with the services. I don't see how tenants could possibly think that we had the upper hand when we're in that position.
It's clear the Dickensian conditions of yesteryear do still exist in some corners. The question for politicians is whether yet extra regulation will make any difference.
Well, I'm joined in the studio by the landlord Paul Routledge, who just appeared in our film there. Thanks for coming in. You saw some of the properties we filmed in. They're appalling. Are you surprised that we still offer accommodation like that in this day and age?
Yes, I am, but that accommodation is not widespread.
Well, we didn't have too much trouble finding it.
No, you wouldn't have trouble finding it, but it's not widespread across the rental sector. There are landlords who do act like that, and they're rogue landlords. And in 2004, we introduced the Housing Act and housing standards to stop landlords like that.
So how are they getting away with it then?
Local authorities are not dealing with it. Every piece of legislation that you require at this precise moment in time is in place to deal with landlords like that.
And yet you say it's the landlords who need protection.
Well, I don't say necessarily landlords or tenants need protection. What we need protection from is we need protection from tenants who continuously move around and use short-hold tenancy agreements as a way to stay in a property and not pay rent and or damage a property. I mean, with my properties, I spend an absolute fortune developing them. But on the other side of it, I have tenants that simply trash them. And when they trash them, there's no criminal proceedings or anything like that. No, I can't get the money for it.
All right, let's bring in the politicians. Paul, I mean, where do your sympathies lie?
Well, obviously, if a tenant has trashed a property, that's terrible. But my sympathies generally lie with the tenant, I have to say, certainly in my area, in the Cotswolds. You know, I've had horror stories from elderly tenants who feel very, very insecure. They're moved on at a whim. If they've complained about a boiler breaking down in the winter, for instance, I had one example, that the landlord decided to evict that.
A revenge eviction.
It was a revenge eviction.
You don't think those happen?
There's no such thing as a revenge eviction.
Well,
Section 21.
That has to be the case.
Okay, first and foremost is, let's get it right here, because what you said there is they throw them out on the street. Yeah. The Section 21 cannot be issued within a fixed term of 6 months. They can only be issued when it goes into statutory... What are you nodding your head for? That's fact. That's the law. They cannot be evicted for the first 6 months unless you issue a Section 8. And Section 8s, are very difficult to get through and have specific criteria to issue in a Section 8. So for the first 6 months, a tenant cannot be evicted. So they can owe up to 6 months' money and not be evicted unless you go into a Section 8. Yeah?
But you can
then when it runs into statutory periodic, you can then instigate proceedings. I've got 4 of those at the moment where the tenant hasn't paid a penny, they've trashed the property, and 9 months down the road, I'm still trying to get rid of them.
That's criminal damage, but what I've seen...
It's not criminal damage. On the contrary, it's not criminal damage.
If you say that they've trashed the property, that's criminal damage.
It's not.
I've seen tenants who have asked for broken windows or roofs to be mended, who've asked for boilers that have broken down to be mended, and rather than that getting dealt with, they have been evicted.
So why don't they go to their housing standards officer and enforce
a lot of them are vulnerable.
The Housing Act
of 2004? A lot of them are vulnerable people who don't realise they have rights. Why should they have to?
What do you mean, why should they have to? Exactly the same way as we deal with...
If they're paying rent to a landlord...
Because there are rogues in our society and there are rules and regulations and laws in place to protect them right now.
Why should a landlord need to be made?
What about the elderly lady lady in the
The problem we have here is, and I don't mean to be rude, but the problem we have here is that you don't know what you're talking about. And what you're talking about is you think we can throw them out on the street.
Well,
First and foremost is every piece of legislation is in place to protect the tenant, not the landlord, yeah?
Ed Miliband wants to bring in tougher regulation, doesn't he, and more protection.
And on letting agencies as well.
Would that, though, reduce the amount of rented accommodation that became available because landlords wouldn't bother?
I think one of the things we have to do is actually get more housing into the sector, because we have a chronic housing shortage.
That I'll agree with you.
Excellent. We have a chronic housing shortage, and we wouldn't be having some of these debates and discussions if tenants weren't vulnerable because they felt they had no choice. Too many people in Bristol, as you saw, I've seen houses in that condition in Bristol. I've seen houses exactly like that in Bristol West. I think it's an absolute disgrace that a landlord should say, I need to be taken and forced to replace ceilings and roofs and walls.
Ed Miliband's proposals address that?
Well, we brought in the 2004 Housing Act that Mr Outledge referred to. We brought that in. We've also brought in housing legislation.
How's he going to do it?
In terms of the rural areas, there's a real lack of 1- and 2-bedroom housing for young and old. So I'm talking about those people.
So you're talking about vulnerable people and a lack of housing.
Yes.
That's got absolutely nothing to do with landlords. That's got nothing to do with landlords doing revenge evictions.
You don't accept that landlords need any more regulation?
They don't need any more regulations. You've got the 2004 Housing Act for a start. You've got deposit protection, yeah? You've got gas boiler safety. I can reel off, about 10, 12 pieces.
Comply, but they don't comply, do they?
But then that's why you have legislation, that's why you have courts. What you're trying to do is you're trying to... No, let's get this right. What you're trying to do is you're trying to... First and foremost is, I believe... No. What you're trying to do is you're trying to... You found a couple of kids that have piddled behind the bike shed, and what you're now trying to do... What you're trying to do is you're trying to blanket the entire PRS and say we're all all like that.
I didn't. Did anyone say that?
Shelter did a survey on this.
Can I just say one thing? No, we have to call a halt here. But I mean, that was more than just a little bit of tenant damage, wasn't it? That was...
I've had tenants do that damage to my property and then go down to housing standards and tell them that I've left it like that.
Paul, thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.